Folks, welcome. I've had several people in the past ask me why we haven't done anything like this before. I've had a number of people suggest that this should have been done sooner. And for those of you who know me well, know that I don't really post for the sake of posting anything on social media. So in terms of a webinar or a podcast, until I found that there was an opportunity for something or someone with extremely high value, I figured I would just hold off. Now, fortunately, I had recently done a webinar with a colleague of mine whom I've known for many, many years. And fortunately, the calendars aligned and we both had a couple of days off just before Christmas. So we have today with us Mr. Peter Stewart from Siege Cyber. Peter has worked in the cybersecurity landscape now for many, many years and has worked for both Sophos and SentinelOne. For those outside of the industry, they are two of the most dominant and industry-leading security vendors in the market. During Peter's time at Sophos, we had a number of engagements, but outside of that, Peter has now started his own cybersecurity and pen testing organization, a company called Siege Cyber. We're going to touch on that today, but the whole context of today's presentation is around pen testing. So Peter, firstly, welcome.
Thank you. That was a great introduction. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome. Really, really appreciate your time today. And I don't want to steal any thunder from you, which I don't think is actually possible. But why don't you just share a little bit about your history, where you've worked, what you've done, and why you decided to start Siege Cyber?
Yeah, where to start? I think it all started back in 2001. I joined Symantec at the time, which was a great company before it wasn't. And I was doing endpoint protection. I was doing for their firewalls, which was the Velociraptor, I think it was, their intrusion prevention, all those kind of cybersecurity things. I was there, and I was in Sydney, so I was there for a few years before I was offered to go to the US. So I was in Silicon Valley for Symantec for about 5 years doing similar things, but more at a global level as opposed to like an APJ level. Then I came back to Brisbane in 2008, worked at a few MSPs like Bridgepoint, which was a great MSP.
MSP.
No longer is around.
Yeah.
Worked for some data centers like iSeek, and then I got back into vendor land again, working at Sophos. I was there for about 6 years, I think. The last year and a half was in the incident response or their rapid response team. I went from Sophos then to SentinelOne, and then I was at SentinelOne for a year. And during that time, I was starting to prepare to start my own sort of business, which was Siege Cyber, where we are today.
And why did you decide to start your own pen testing company?
So working for the vendors, we work with a lot of MSPs, and I've always truly believed that security assessments, pen testing, vulnerability assessments, all of those kind of things are literally the best way to get visibility of a client's network, to understand, if someone was to attack my network, what do they see, which is all about the visibility, and also just sort of finding where the vulnerabilities are. So I've always been a huge believer in pen testing, especially at Sophos when I was in the incident response side. If the companies that were calling us who have just been hacked had have gone through a pen test, then they wouldn't have been hacked in the first place. Working with a lot of MSPs at the different vendors, I could see that that was a sort of a blind spot. Pen testers, unfortunately, don't like fixing printers and don't like doing other things. So it's challenging for MSPs because they're a very expensive resource. And unless you've got a year's worth of pen tests lined up, it's tough to keep them on the books. Yeah. So that's kind of where Siege Cyber started. We would partner with MSPs. We would do pen testing. We could do white labeling, or we could just it started out as white labeling, but then very quickly I discovered that most MSPs don't want white labeling. They want to have an independent third party do the security testing for their customers. So it's kind of a win-win for everyone. The customer gets an independent assessment, the MSP gets a check of the work they've been doing, and then the customer gets the value of both those things.
Yeah, I would say I've certainly noticed for some of the managed services providers, MSPs, we've had some tenders that we were asked whether or not we did our own pen testing. And philosophically, I am of the belief that the company that's checking the quality of the work shouldn't be the company that's actually doing the work as well. So philosophically, I think that's where we're on the same page, and it's been quite complimentary for us. And I'm going to come back to your pen testing days again in a moment. But I suspect from your time at Sophos in the incident response, you would have seen a couple of very interesting scenarios during your time there. Anything that comes to mind?
Wow. I suppose one of the biggest things I discovered, like seeing customers all over the world become compromised by threat actors, is that they're not massively sophisticated. So, like, I always had the assumption that the threat actors that were hacking into companies were doing some sort of kung fu that no one's ever seen before, and I'm sure that happens. But 99% of the time, that the particular company has left a door open, has not patched a machine, has missed something, and that's what allowed the attacker to get into the network. So it's the fundamentals. Like, I just feel like, and this is where kind of pen testing I think also helps, is that customers were missing the fundamentals.
The basics.
The basics, that would allow an attacker into the network. Now, if you've got 10,000 servers and 100,000 employees, it's very difficult to manage all of those sort of things. So I kind of understand it at the same time, but it's from an attack point of view, it's just missing those fundamentals. Yeah.
So outside of those fundamentals, ultimately what I also refer to as that low-hanging fruit, those quick wins. With the MSPs that you've seen involved, you would have also seen quite a range of quality of managed services provider and infrastructure. Is there any, I know you're under non-disclosure agreements and confidentiality, but is there any stories that you can share that come to mind in terms of incidents or train wrecks to do with MSPs, just from a humorous perspective? I'm curious more than anything.
Yeah, well, I mean, unfortunately, supply chain attacks are real. So some of the big ones, we saw the customer get hacked through their MSP. We've seen MSPs use the same credentials for all their clients. So once one MSP gets compromised, then the attacker has access to all of their clients. That's a big issue. And then you have, I think it was Kaseya, they got hacked, and then all of those things that came through there. I feel with MSPs, there's been a split. We have, up until about 10 years ago, all of the MSPs were kind of the same. Break fix, they would do cloud, they would get on all these different things. But I would say a few years ago, I've seen this split between the two MSPs. We have the MSPs that have gone off on one angle, who are very, very focused on cybersecurity and very proud of the work that they do with their clients. So that's whether it's in Azure or AWS or any of those sort of things. And then we have the kind of what I would classify as maybe the legacy MSPs that are still focused on just trying to keep their head above water and fixing computers and fixing printers. And that's kind of where we've sort of seen the difference. These guys here are the ones that want to do all the pen tests for their customers because they're proud of the work they do. These ones here are just trying to stay on top of it.
Yeah, and they're probably, these newer mindsets of MSPs are wanting to identify the blind spots that they're not aware of. And part of my philosophy is that as a managed services provider, your primary responsibility is about keeping the lights on, or at least that's what it used to be. And these days, the security aspect of things needs to be baked into the design. And at Cymax, I will often say that we are not an MSSP, and that through a lot of my coaching and mentoring that I do with other managed services providers, I'm still reasonably mortified when I see the low baseline that these current MSPs are operating from in terms of their security stack. A lot of the time they just assume, well, I will say some of the time, they assume that because they're selling endpoint security on a monthly basis to their clients, that they're selling security. And that's just such a tiny piece of the puzzle. It's that tip of the iceberg, really. But I want to come back to Siege Cyber for a moment and how you first started. Maybe tell me a little bit about your first client your first memory or two, and kind of what kicked it off for you? Where was that tipping point when you said, today is the day I am out seeing my first client?
I was, to be honest with you, I was kind of asked to do it. I've been rattling around the idea of doing it. I've been talking to a few different people, and it was a compliance friend of mine who was doing ISO 27001.
Right.
And he was looking for someone to do a pen test for one of his customers because they were going for their ISO compliance. And it's kind of where it started. That was the first official client, and then from there it's kind of just ballooned. But that's sort of where that was the first client. But yeah, and that's kind of also started the whole partnership thing within Siege Cyber as well.
So we've spoken about this before offline, but both you and I have seen pen test results from different organizations, those where you're sitting more in there from a governance and a strategic level, and as a result, to maintain integrity, you've got to be impartial and third party, so you don't do the pen test yourself, but you are seeing the pen test results from the organization. And we as a managed services provider, with the array of clientele that we've got, having varying degrees of quality in pen testing. What was the reason for you with that very first client when you said, I'm actually not going to send this to a third party? Maybe it was, I think I can do a better job, or there would be some reason that for you when you said, this is where we can deliver that outcome. Do you remember what that was?
Yeah, well, I think working in the SOFOS incident response, there is a lot of subpar assessments out there. To be honest with you, yeah. Look, in Australia, we have a lot of great companies. Unfortunately, some of those companies use offshore resources, which have mixed results. Some of the companies in Australia will use offshore resources as well, and it was just the quality just wasn't there. Like, it was more of a vulnerability assessment, if anything.
Yeah, basic script, right?
Just a script. It's just a tool that they would run. Yeah.
So, from a compliance perspective, then, what are the concerns with engaging an Australian-based firm that's using a third party overseas to do their pen testing? Is there anything that an organisation needs to be aware of, or any sort of disclosure obligations that should be considered?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think it's happening. I mean, as in the disclosure side of it, I think a lot of the companies out there are using offshore resources. Mm. You have to imagine that your data, like your passwords and usernames and network information and anything that comes out of a pen test, which is highly sensitive, could be sitting on a machine anywhere else in the world. And how do you know it's being destroyed? How do you know it's not still sitting there today? That's my biggest fear. So when I started Siege Cyber, I had a strict rule. Everyone's going to be within Australia, because I just don't want that data going overseas.
So I've certainly seen through the RSS feeds that we get that there was a pen tester a few months ago, and they retained these credentials that you're talking about. Could have been hash passwords or anything like that. And because they hadn't actually purged the data after doing the pen test, the pen tester was compromised, which is it's ironic in its own. The pen tester was compromised, and as a byproduct, all those credentials were then available to them, easily accessible to then be reverse engineered at a convenient time. What's your philosophy on that? How long do you retain the data for your pen tests? Just step me through some of that process.
So I personally want to get rid of the data as quick as possible. I don't want to hold it. If there's something that we have to hold, we encrypt everything. So everything's based in Australia, everything's on servers, and any data that's sitting at rest is absolutely encrypted. And I'll actually go out of my way to make sure that if we don't need it, we're getting rid of it. Because data is this interesting thing, and I think you actually might have told me this, so I might be using your words here, where it's, data is great up until the point where you should no longer hold it, and then it becomes a massive liability. And you see it with Medibank, you see it with all these big Optus, all these big companies. It's one thing to get hacked, right? You get hacked and your data's stolen. it's a whole nother question. It's like, well, our data was stolen, but why did you have this data in the first place?
Yeah.
That's the thing that I don't think really people are talking about, and that's something that worries me, is that if I don't need it, I'm getting rid of it, because it's a liability at that point.
Yeah, you're spot on, and thank you. the saying for me is that data is an asset for your business right up until the point that you don't need it. And then at the point that you don't need it anymore, we have to shift our focus from it being a possible asset in the future to it actually being a liability. And even during that time where it is an asset, the over-collection of the data under the obligation of what you're required to collect is still a liability. And post the need for that same data, it's also a liability when you're over-retaining it. And one of the examples that I use is in the residential college context. You would have potentially minors who are with you for a period of time, and you would need certain extra information from their parents until those minors become an adult. And then once they're an adult, they're still a resident at the school or the college or whatever the residency is, and you might need to keep some medical information for that period of time where they're staying with you. But the moment that they don't live there anymore, how many people are circling back and purging the data that's no longer necessary for the tenure that they were there? Maybe from an alumni and a records keeping perspective, you'd want to keep the data to say XYZ stayed with us from this date until this date. But realistically, the financial position of their parents and their ability to pay the rent during that time, their medical history, their allergies, none of that stuff becomes relevant anymore the moment that they're no longer staying there and you're responsible for that young adult. And I use that as a contextual example because you're absolutely right. Data is this invisible liability that exists on our balance sheet. And for the early era of IT, we're always taught that data it's an asset. You've got to keep this data. You've got to retain it for as long as possible. But in the context of being a pen tester, they need not physically compromise an environment because you were there. You've got a copy of all of those credentials, even if they're encrypted or in hash form. If they get a copy of that, they can just reverse that out and take as much time as they need before they then coordinate their planned attack. And no doubt they've then got the internal diagrams of what their network looks like as a byproduct of all of the data that's been compromised. So I think you're right. There is this responsibility and governance of data when it comes to your job is now completed, and the over-retention of that data from that period of time is something that needs to be seriously considered.
Yeah, I say save the hard drives, get rid of the data. if you no longer need it anymore.
But there's also a difference between disk level encryption and file level encryption as well.
Yes.
So you can have your data encrypted on a hard drive, but that still doesn't mean if that drive is online that the data itself is safe if it hasn't been encrypted using file level encryption. What are your thoughts on that?
I think, well, for one, again, coming back to liability, if I don't need it, I don't want it. So I try to get rid of everything. We have a lot of reoccurring customers that come back each year for their annual pen test. And, you know, it's good to start on a clean slate. You know, I don't want myself or our pen testers to go in there sort of having a sneak peek into it anyway. I mean, there's some information that we grab, like subnets and the scope of the pen test. But in regards to encrypting, look, I think there's never enough. You know, I just think, like, you know, I'm a big believer in, you know, having offline backups, and those should be encrypted, because if they end up in landfill or something, you know, people do grab these things.
The old filing cabinet from the government that ended up on landfill and had sensitive information. It's no different from physical data in a physical file as a hard drive that ends up in landfill and is not encrypted, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Or a laptop that got left on a train, which seems to happen all the time. You know, you can get access to those. That they might have disk level encryption, but if the attacker has gotten onto the machine through a phishing attack, or they've somehow got credentials, or worse yet, the kid is using the laptop, their son or daughter is using the laptop, which has sensitive information on it. All those files are unencrypted whilst that laptop's running. For full disk encryption, they're only really encrypted once it's sort of shut down and those sort of things. And a lot of laptops, if they're in standby mode, they're technically just still running. So if you leave that standby mode laptop on a train, for example, it's an opportunity for an attacker, a skilled one at that, to potentially get access to it. And those are the kind of things that we have to think about when storing data and what we do with it. Yeah.
So, Peter, what you do is quite technical, but for the audience that could be watching this, they're not quite as technical. Explain to us in as best a non-technical way as you can what a pen tester does.
That's a great question. The way I like to think about it is a pen test or a security assessment is visibility. It gives the business owner visibility as to what their network looks like through the eyes of an attacker. So we hear on the news, Medibank got hacked and this company got hacked. But, unless you're sort of living in the technical world, you don't really know, what does that mean, or if I'm vulnerable. And there's a big blind spot for a lot of C-suite people or managing directors or directors, where I feel a good pen test gives them visibility. Like, this is what the attacker sees from the outside of the network. This is what the attacker will see if they were to actually get inside your network through a phishing attack or an insider threat or disgruntled employee, or someone just walks in and just plugs in a NUC into your meeting room. It's the visibility. And then that's what the managers get out of it, and the directors and the owners get. And then the technical teams, they get basically a list of all the areas that they can go and start to shut doors and shut windows to stop an attacker getting into the network. That's kind of how I see it. And if I was to explain it to someone non-technical, that's, I think, visibility and a to-do list of things to clean up is probably around cybersecurity is probably the best way. From a technical point of view, we look at a network from the outside, from the inside, we look at websites, and we're really looking for ways that an attacker can get into someone's network. And then once they're in there, what can they do? What can they find? Can they read the CEO's email? Can they find credit card numbers? Is there a machine that someone's just put in a corner and forgotten about, which is opening them up to a much greater attack?
Yeah, interesting. I've always said that if the Pentagon itself can be breached with the Pentagon budget, that any threat actor with sufficient resources, being time and money, can compromise any environment. But ultimately what you're saying here is that there's fundamentally things that an organization can do.
Absolutely.
To make it harder.
Yes, yeah. Every time we finish a pen test, we do a handover meeting.
Yeah.
And that handover meeting is we sit down together and we go through the report line by line, and it's an opportunity for our clients to ask any questions.
So you've got this report, you've had a scope of engagement, and that engagement normally lasts for a couple of weeks. And within that, you're providing the business with a snapshot that's highlighting to them how someone with sufficient motivation and resources could compromise their network, and potentially how long it would take for them to compromise that environment. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I would say so, yeah.
So, Peter, in your experience of having done these pen tests for multiple organizations now over many, many years, what are the low-hanging pieces of fruit, the fundamental things that you were talking about before, that you would suggest that an organization has done either by their internal IT department or their managed services provider before they engage any pen tester for services to ensure that they're getting maximum value from their investment?
Oh, it's kind of an easy one. That is an easy question, thank you. Look, patching is number one. Removing old operating systems. The amount of old SQL servers we see floating around networks, or the old servers that are just rife with vulnerabilities, is crazy, really. So understanding what devices are in your network, understanding what the patch levels are, and patching those. I recommend to all our customers patch everything, because we will pick it up and we will find it and we will put it in the report, but it makes the report a lot more busy than it probably should be, because you're too busy patching stuff. That would be number one. Number two, and it sounds ridiculous, is just remove default credentials. So one of the last things we do with every pen test is we go to every web server, every FTP server, anything that allows a login, and we just try the default credentials. And guaranteed, almost every customer we have has a printer or a fax machine or a phone or something in the network that someone's bought and put into the network, hasn't changed the default password. And then that just allows us to sort of hop on and potentially, depending on the device, do whatever. These devices are just Linux machines a lot of the times. Like working back in Symantec for the incident response, we had situations where customers, like big customers, got completely ransomwared. So the organization would have teams of people come in, wipe all of the machines, wipe all of the servers, build everything again, shut all the doors on the firewall so no one could get back into the network, and then a week later they get compromised again. And I believe in that particular case, it was the attacker got access to a printer. He had a home inside the printer. So although he couldn't come back in from the internet into the organization, the printer was actually calling back home to allow him then to sort of come back in that way. So the smallest of devices, anything that's plugged into the network needs to be monitored and patched and updated, and please change the default credentials, because it's just one of those things. It's a very simple thing. Just change the default password. And unfortunately, I think the vendors have a big part to play in this. Like, no organization, if they're putting devices into people's networks, there should be a policy. In fact, that's probably where I would go with it, is every organization should have some sort of policy that if you put devices into my network, you must patch them regularly, and there must be a schedule of that. You must make sure there's no default password. If every Australian company had that, then we'd basically get rid of that whole thing very, very quickly.
Yes.
So patching, default credentials, what else would it be? Open ports, especially external facing open ports. To be honest with you, most organizations that we work with have gotten much better at this. The MSPs are getting much better at this. So we're not seeing these random ports like remote desktop or SSH or any of these sort of ports open to the internet, but it does still happen. Any service that's open to the internet that allows someone to log in is a heartbeat away from getting compromised, unless it's a security device like a firewall and a VPN. But if you have RDP open, or if you have SSH or something like that open, you're guaranteed, in the time that you and I have been talking today, that device would have had 100 people, or at least scripts, trying to log into it. And sooner or later, they're going to get it right. Or there's going to be an issue with that software that's going to allow the attacker into the network.
That's right, yeah. Something that's not necessarily vulnerable today doesn't mean that it's not going to be vulnerable tomorrow or next week or next month.
Yeah, and that's the biggest challenge we have is staying on top of it. Yeah.
So you talked a moment ago about unpatched SQL servers, unpatched database servers. Have you got any of those where you've been able to compromise them? And can you talk to what sort of data was there sitting there, a hacker's delight in terms of information that was on an unpatched database system?
Yeah, so we did a web application pen test relatively recently, in which allowed us then to get access to a database. Now, if we get to the point where we can access the database, we kind of, within the security testing, we don't want to delve too deep, because we don't want to be pulling out too much customer data, but we want to get to a point where we can have a screenshot that says we were here. So we were actually, this is a website that's open to the public, and we were able to sort of get in, get access to the back-end database, and just dump all of the tables, which had all sorts of customer records in it. Those are the ones that keep me up at night. They're the ones that scare me, because they're just a heartbeat away from, if it wasn't us doing it, it could be someone else doing it.
Yeah, we certainly came across a similar scenario probably in the last 12 months, where there was an unpatched database server running a finance system, and the business itself had all of the right processes in place for changing payroll and payment details for their creditors. But because the database itself was running unencrypted and hadn't been patched, the right threat actor would have just been able to go straight into the database, modify the bank details, the BSB and the account number at mass for a pay run or for a supplier run, and potentially pull $1 million worth of payroll or a couple of $1 million worth of creditor payments without even having to interact with a human being. And until people started following up in regards to them not getting paid for their wages, or a supplier saying you haven't paid us for our outstanding invoices, it could be weeks before they're aware of it. And by then the horse has already bolted. There's no way of clawing that money back because they've probably muled it somewhere else and now it's overseas somewhere. So I agree with you there. There's definitely some value in making sure that those systems are patched. There's also a story that comes to mind for me with, you were talking about all of these devices, these smart devices that are being connected to the network. There's an article on the web that talks about one of the casinos in the US that was breached as a byproduct of having a smart device, an IoT. It was the fish tank thermostat, and it was connected directly to the same network where the high rollers database resided. And it's for that reason, any of these environments that we've got, we've taken the position now, we've had to assume that unless it's something that we maintain, that we have a managed services agreement on, it is likely to be an unsafe device. So anything IoT related, we will put that on a completely separate network. We will segment out CCTV footage from telephones, we've got laundry management systems. There's a myriad of boom gate controls and all these different bits and pieces where different clients want to be able to get in remotely and have a look at the data. But the risk in the remote access is that if it's remote accessible to them, if it hasn't been secured correctly, it's also remote accessible to other parties. And we don't always have assurances that, number one, they've got a maintenance agreement in place for maintaining that third-party IoT device. And if I use CCTV cameras as an example, there's a dark web site that you can go to. Actually, it's not even dark web. There's a website that you can go to, and it will tell you about all of the cameras that are publicly accessible on the internet.
Showdan.io.
Showdan.io, that's the one.
One of my favourite sites, yeah.
But you can go there, and it will show you all of the CCTV camera footage via a hyperlink. You do a Google search for a camera. I want to see a camera in San Francisco on this day, and you're in. And that's the sort of stuff that we're seeing on these networks. It's also one of the reasons why we strongly recommend that the CCTV or any sort of IoT device is not publicly accessible to the internet. Even with that being said, unless the CCTV company is actually doing the maintenance on these devices, they could still be unpatched. And this is where the convergence of all of this technology on the network has created a byproduct of pretty significant risk for the IT administrators, the CIOs, or the MSPs that are ultimately being responsible for all of these sorts of things. So have you noticed with the work that you do, these IoT devices, what percentage of them would you say have been sufficiently maintained in terms of critical patch and vulnerability maintenance?
I would say a very, very small percentage, to be honest with you. I think going back, the vendors who are putting these devices in honestly still have a lot to answer for when putting these devices in. And unfortunately, when a pump just pumps, no one wants to touch it. So they don't want the downtime, because if that pump stops pumping, whether it be for a heart or a dam or something, it can cause major issues. So they just don't touch it and they leave it, which it's a fine line, because if you don't patch it, then you could have major issues later on if someone was to actually compromise it, or if it's just getting old. Even old software starts to fail on new networks and new packets and those kind of things. So honestly, I think the OT side of it is really falling behind. Unfortunately, some customers are stuck with having OT in just due to organic growth. They're stuck having OT in their corporate network. There is no division between the two, which is very, very dangerous, because they've got devices here and devices there, and the network has grown organically over the past 10 years. And it's kind of hard to rewind the clock and build a network in the right design unless you're putting a lot of effort and money into it. But I think we're getting to the point where we just have to.
But it's either money invested at the start, or it's money that you're throwing at trying to solve the problem when there's an outage.
Correct.
And you talk about patching pumps. It reminds me of a story of the oil pipeline in the US that was compromised.
Yes.
And if I understand that scenario correctly, that was also a byproduct of not doing the necessary maintenance on their network.
Yeah, that's right. And then it goes back to, a lot of these attacks aren't sophisticated. People want to think that attackers, and granted, some of them are very, very smart, but a lot of these attacks aren't geniuses that are doing this. They're taking advantage of an opportunity, and with that opportunity allows them to get access to systems that they shouldn't be able to get access to. That's why it's very difficult for customers to sort of stay on top of it.
So, Peter, you talk about a lot of these attacks being unsophisticated. There was a company here in Australia that decided that they weren't going to hire someone, and I'm going back probably about 15, maybe a little bit longer years, and this person was disgruntled by the fact that they were overlooked for the job. They taught themselves how to hack using YouTube. And they weren't particularly skilled at what they do, and I know that we've been talking today about some of the fundamentals, which are for a lot of organizations, that's the opportunistic side of it. But a lot of these attacks, really, they are opportunistic. If someone's motivated enough, again, with the right resources, time and money, it's likely that they'll compromise an environment. And then it comes down to the reduction of dwell time, reducing how long they're in, or potentially the damage that they can do within that environment. But certainly, from what you're telling me, it seems that most of the styles of attacks that you're seeing in the organizations that you were working with before going out and starting Siege Cyber, they're all opportunistic.
Yes.
Most of them. Sorry.
Yes. Well, and it brings up a valid point. So, we are seeing the ones that are getting ransomware and are actually getting hit, but I guarantee you that there are a lot of customers out there that are compromised as we speak, and the attackers just staying quiet. I think they did a statistic where the attackers generally in someone's network for about 3 months before they drop their payloads, and that's to work out the lay of the land, work out what the emails are doing, where the good systems are, who's doing the backups, potentially turn off the backups. So one of the scary things is that there's a lot of organisations here in Australia right now that probably have attackers inside their network that are just waiting for that right time to strike. And, we're coming into Christmas right now. I can tell you a funny story. So part of the Sophos Rapid Response team is that obviously I was in Australia, and we had another colleague, and we would follow the sun. So, the US guys would go to sleep and then would come online and head over to the UK, and we'd kind of all just pass around.
Right.
Now, the worst time to actually be on call is during American Thanksgiving, Christmas. Any time there's a big holiday in the US is the time that you don't want to be covering, because guaranteed there's going to be an attack. So coming into Christmas, like we're sort of 2024, coming into Christmas now, I truly believe that we're going to see some attacks come through. Will they hit the news or not? Don't know. But this is the time. This is the season for the attackers. They're looking for skeleton crews. They've been sitting in the network for a couple of months now. They understand what they need to do. They can, if they were to trip over some tripwires and something pops up in a seam somewhere or some sort of central logging, someone might miss it because that person's enjoying Christmas or New Year's. And this is the time that I feel that most of the attacks happen, where unfortunately the rest of Australia in particular is in holiday mode, much like I would like to be right now.
Well, thanks again for coming in on a couple of days before Christmas.
Absolutely.
Now, you touched on seams.
Yes.
And before we sat down to have a conversation, you asked me about whether or not Cymax ran a seam. Mm-hmm. Do you want to just talk a little bit about a seam, a socket saw, where you see the benefits, and maybe even why, like you hit on just Christmas a moment ago, why this is the worst time to be on call, but maybe the benefits in having a third-party SIEM or a SIEM SOC SOAR provider?
Yeah, so I was asking because obviously the ASD Essential 8, as you get to the higher levels, level 2 and 3, they talk about monitoring the controls and being able to respond in a timely manner. I don't know what a timely manner is, but I would imagine it's in my mind, a timely manner is obviously within a couple of hours. But anyway,
you would be amazed.
I would be amazed. I'm sure.
You would be amazed at what timely manner actually means, and some of the emails that I've received from various official agencies and the time it's taken from incident to receiving that email. But I do interrupt. I apologise.
Well, and I suppose the reason why I was asking is because I think central logging and someone looking at your reports or looking at your events is critical. And it kind of brings me back to that old saying, and I'm going to screw it up, I'm sure, which is like, if a tree falls in a forest and no one's there to hear it, did it make a sound? And it's kind of the same thing with security events. Like if you see 12 failed logins to your SQL server very, very quickly, and then you see a successful one and no one's actually looking at it, it could just get missed altogether and no one even knows they've been compromised. So I think it's mandatory for a lot of organisations, and I'm glad that ASD is pushing it as well, that people are looking at these things 24/7, and or at least alerts are popping up, and you have MSPs like yourself that are monitoring it and responding to it and those kind of things. It's critical in the world we live in today.
It's funny you should mention the ASD and the Essential 8. I was talking with another MSP, a colleague of mine, and they provide, what's the term that they use? They provide co-assist services to medium-sized businesses. So as a managed services provider, they were doing all of the work that they should be doing. They were patching the systems. They were making sure that the hypervisors were up to date and the firewalls were patched and the Windows machines, the Windows servers and the workloads were all up to date. The organization themselves was responsible for all of the others, the user account management, activation, deactivation, those sorts of things. And I know one of the controls in Essential 8 Maturity Level 2 is that privileged accounts need to be disabled after a very short period of time of inactivity. The byproduct was this organization did not do that. They actually had a staff member who had been deceased for nearly 2 years. That account was still left open on the network. So the hackers found a copy of these credentials somewhere on the dark web. Perhaps this person got phished before they passed away. But because that account was still privileged, they were able to use those credentials to then compromise a fully patched and maintained system, ransomware the whole production environment. But as you also mentioned before, using those credentials, they were also able to compromise the backups.
Yes, yep. So they're administrator level privileges, right?
They're unrestricted, right? So I think that's a perfect example of where these fundamentals, and to me, the Essential 8 is exactly that. It's the essential things that should be done. It's not the comprehensive 8. It's not the all-encompassing. These are the basics. These are the fundamental 8 things that should be done. One of them is good user account management and user hygiene. And because that got missed, it doesn't matter how much patching and maintenance was done. You have a privileged account that has unrestricted access to your entire network internally. We can talk about restricting lateral movement if you're using PIM or PAM or something like that. But in reality, this is an account that should not have existed on that network for the better part of 2 years, right? Have you seen situations like that?
All the time. One of the things, especially with the on-premise AD, is generally 9 times out of 10 we'll get administrative privileges on the network. And the first thing we do is we go through the list of all the different users, and we're looking in the comments to see if anyone's left any little nuggets for us, in the comments of the username. But we see all the time, like there'll be 3 different MSP administrator accounts, and those MSP accounts are from like 3 MSPs ago, that the accounts are still valid, and although the MSP is not using them anymore, they're just sitting there. Or you have people. Another one is Like the IT guys, their everyday account is the administrator account. From a pen testing point of view, we absolutely love that.
But it's also, again, one of the essential 8, right? Your day-to-day operational account should not be the same account that you use for managing the system.
Correct, absolutely. But and I can see personally from a pen testing point of view why they put that in there. Because if we can capture hashes from the guys who are just using their administrator account from it as an everyday account, we can replay those on anything. And then from there, we've got access, domain admin access, which is kind of one of the ways that we do get up into the domain admin. So I'm with you. Like, I have kind of like a love-hate relationship with ASD Essential 8.
Yeah, I can relate.
I think there's a lot of good things in it, but I also think it's very narrow focused, and I think it doesn't really go. It kind of paints a brush across everyone, whether you're a 4-user organization or a 4,000-user organization. They're two very different networks, but ASD Essential 8 is kind of like, well, we're just going to paint this whole thing with the same brush. I think it misses a lot of things, and as you said, and correctly, it is the essential. So maybe that's where the focus is. So I love that Australia has gone to the point of actually putting this all together and having these things, but at the same time, there's so much more that we can be doing. And I think in today's environment, we have to be taking it to the next level.
So I'm curious. You've worked with IT departments.
Yep.
You've worked with, and you call them MSPs, managed services providers, who are ultimately a third party doing the maintenance and support for an organization's infrastructure. Have you been to some of those sites where you've done the pen test in year 1 and then you've circled back in year 2 and you've noticed that the things that you'd identified that needed to be remediated from the first year hadn't even been done the second year? Is there any examples you've got of?
All the time. I kind of think of it as like, someone explained this to me in regards to compliance, and I think the same thing is relevant with pen testing, is that it's kind of like going to the dentist and the dentist says you have to floss. So you go home and for the next month you're flossing all the time. And then you kind of stop flossing, and then another 12 months goes past and you go back to the dentist, and the dentist is like, you need to floss again. I think pen tests are kind of the same. Compliance, absolutely the same. Pen testing is kind of the same. We come in, we do an assessment, we go, hey, you need to fix all these things, and they might jump on it and they might fix those things, most of them. The hard ones, they kind of just get forgotten about. But then we come back and we see the same things again. Now, there might be new vulnerabilities or they might need new patching, sure. But the idea is, we're not just patching this one. We want a policy, or we want a regime around patching. So it's kind of like a culture within the business of we patch all the time, not just we did a pen test, let's patch it and forget about it for 12 months. It's like, okay, the pen tester found these things. We should be reviewing what ports are open on the firewall.
So an organization, doesn't matter if they're large or small, if they've got an internal department or an external department, should have some sort of service level agreement or some sort of policy around the frequency of patching.
Correct. Absolutely. A lot of MSPs are really good at this, and but then not all of them are. Not all MSPs are created equal. Let's put it that way. I feel that if you have a really good MSP, they're already doing it. It's already happening. If you find that out of a pen test that you have systems that aren't being patched, then I think a few questions need to be asked as to why they weren't being patched. Policy, I think, is everything. I've never really been a policy guy at all. Like, I fall asleep when someone says the word policy, but the more I get into cybersecurity, the more we do pen tests, the more we work with customers, the more I realize just how important it is. So having a policy with your MSP that says, yes, we are going to do this, or the MSP a lot of times will say, this is our SLA, this is what we're going to do for you. And that's kind of what you're looking for from a customer's point of view, is having that. And if you don't have that, maybe you need to have your own policy of like, we want this. Do you agree to it or not?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit sad that we exist in this era now where certain things like patching like flossing, as you said, need to be measured when ultimately it should just be a fundamental thing that's done as part of anybody's scope of work. And yet I have seen some organizations where the department, there will be a whole IT department, has certain key internet-facing services that they haven't patched because they've got these two competing business rules within the organization. They've got the IT department saying these systems need to be patched, but then they've also got the marketing department saying these systems need to be available and downtime equals money to the business. So in that instance, there's these opposing requirements within the business. So at some level, somebody needs to sign off a policy that says these patches need to be applied within this period of time, with the understanding that potentially it's going to affect revenue. You talked about a pump and a pump stopping, whether it's your heart that stops pumping or a water pump or an oil pump. Downtime equals usually money in those sorts of instances, but unplanned downtime usually equals a lot more money as a byproduct of
10x the downtime, if not more. And look, let's face it, patching is sometimes difficult. Like, it can be hard and it can be costly. But I just think it's one of those things, like, back to the flossing thing, like, yeah, I could not floss and, but you have to do it. And I also think there's another thing there where 10 years ago, or 5-10 years ago, patching generally took machines down. Like, you want to keep your machines up and running, and then you would patch your Windows server, and then that patch didn't work, and so a lot of people, especially who have been in the industry more than 5 minutes, are kind of a bit hesitant sometimes about patching. But that has changed. Like, these days the patching is really good. So I think it's just one of those things that we just have to do, whether it's your phone or your computer or your servers or your firewall or your home router. Like, there has to be patching on it. And it's free. It's a fundamental thing. And it stops a lot of attacks.
It's funny that you should mention that. Patching has certainly gotten better. There's a lot less systems that crash as a byproduct of patching. And yet we still have the occasional system from time to time that has an unplanned side effect as a byproduct of patching. And that's where having the business understand that there is this underpinning policy that says these systems need to be patched at least gives the organization some level of understanding. The user might be frustrated, but I think the frustration as a byproduct of an outage is significantly smaller than the frustration that might be associated with some level of compromise. And that's the way that I kind of look at things. There's going to be the occasion where there'll be downtime or an application that doesn't work, or I've seen a patch that's broken printing, of all things. And then the manufacturer of the printer needs to release an updated driver because the previous version of their printer driver wasn't as secure, so the printing doesn't work. The inconvenience of having a printer not work versus the inconvenience of an outage because of a compromise are two very different levels of frustration. And I think it's about managing that and communicating that within the business.
It is. There's always risks, and you have to weigh it up. But I think we're at a point now where it is more risky to not patch than it is to patch.
Oh, I'd completely agree with that.
And that's the big change from 5-10 years ago to today, is that it's now outweighed. Yes, there is risk. And honestly, patches could down servers, but the risk is greater for not doing it. And that's something that it's a new mental shift that everyone needs to sort of, understand, and it has changed.
I would also say that the downtime for a server as a byproduct of a patch, if it's scheduled, is manageable. But if you've got a server that you cannot afford to have that level of downtime as a byproduct of a patch, then that environment needs to be redesigned so that it's not dependent on a single server being available. That's where you would need to have a proper cluster so that you can take one server out of the farm, patch it, test it, reintroduce it to the farm, and then take the next one out so that that outage isn't there. But that's also where it's important to understand the business drivers and to make sure that you've got the technology that underpins that to operate those expectations. Because as you said, systems have to be patched, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Same thing with firewalls. That's why you have HA firewalls.
High availability
firewalls. So you can patch one while still passing traffic. And then once that one's patched, you bring him up and put him down and patch him. And that's kind of where cloud environments come in a lot more, and having that infrastructure that is resilient. Now, if you get hit by a ransomware attack, doesn't matter how many servers you have in the cluster, they're all going. And that's where I think we need to start really getting better at the fundamentals.
That's why you've got a patch in the first place, right?
Correct.
So it's either the inconvenience of a minor planned outage versus the major inconvenience of potentially a full system outage or a ransomware attack, which, if they've compromised your backups, could take the entire organization offline.
Absolutely. Yep.
I want to ask you a question. We've worked together on a number of different sites now and over a couple of years, and Cymax has certainly seen different pen testers and different reports, different clients engaging. And one of the questions that I've been asked before, and I'm sure that this is something that would be of interest to those out there, is what would you say is the value in bringing a pen tester in for a second year engagement or a third year engagement, as opposed to having an organization engaging a different pen tester perhaps for that second year, and then maybe a different pen tester for the third year? What would your comments on that be?
I think having someone that understands the business drivers, having someone that understands the network and has a relationship with the organization, there's a lot of value in that. We do have a lot of customers that want to use different pen testers, and I kind of understand why they might do that, because a pen tester can be very narrow focused. Like they love these particular vulnerabilities, they're very strong at that, but these ones over here they're not so strong at, so they kind of just might leave these ones. Now, a really good seasoned professional can do it all, and will have the lists and the processes in place to make sure it covers all of it. But especially if you get some junior ones, they're very focused. So I think, unfortunately, a lot of the customers out there have seen very mixed results by using the same pen testing company over and over again, because, and I've heard it 1,000 times, where it's like, we're going to someone else, that's why we're talking to you, because we just see the same stuff year after year after year. And then that's why they're reaching out to us initially.
So how do you mitigate that with that sort of response? We're seeing the same results year after year.
So we do two things. One is we don't have any juniors at Siege Cyber. Everyone's a seasoned professional. Everyone knows exactly what they need to do. The other thing is that we kind of mix the pen testers up as well. So even seasoned professionals can sometimes be very good and very strong in some areas. So we try to mix them as well. So we'll kind of go, okay, well, Scott, you did this one last year, so now we're going to move Sasha into this one, and then switch them around again. And that's kind of how we sort of mitigate it. And also, by just not really having juniors, or at least not juniors that are sort of working on customers' sites.
What I would also say in regards to that is that I can identify with what you're saying. We've had clients who have had the same pen testing organization from year one go back and do basically the same tests that they did in year one in year two, and because anything that had been identified had already been remediated, they've spent money and they've gotten almost no value from that second year investment, versus the pen tests that Siege Cyber has done for other clients in year two and year three, where it's a different style of test, or as you said, it's a different pen tester using different hacking techniques, because not all threat actors use the same styles of attacks. And I think that benefit of having intimacy of the environment, so should the inevitable occur, then you and your team have a better intimate level of understanding than they would if they went to an organization that might have 3 junior consultants, 2 semi-seasoned and a principal consultant all working on that organization, and no one really understanding the business as intimately as I have seen your organization does with the clients that we've engaged with together.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's challenging because every cybersecurity company is built a little bit different. At Siege Cyber, we really try to understand the business drivers within the organisation, because that's the best way that we can sort of help them move forward. And then also having, the seasoned professionals, which, we don't really have any juniors. Everyone within Siege Cyber sort of runs their own kind of business to a degree, where this is their customer, they're going to see it all the way through. Having the same company continuous means that we get to build a relationship, and we get to understand, things that we can and can't do, or areas that they're concerned about. We can go back on previous reports and go, hey, look, guys, we've told you about this. Come on, we need to get this thing fixed. And understanding that, where if you're constantly jumping between pen testers, you don't know what you're going to get. And unfortunately, in Australia, we have a lot of great pen testing companies. We also have a lot of really bad pen testing companies as well. So it's I kind of see it as like an accountant to a degree. You go back to your accountant year after year, there's a lot of great accountants out there. There's a lot of very expensive accountants, a lot of very cheap accountants. But sooner or later, you're going to find one that actually just suits your style and understands your business and understands where you're going and what you're trying to achieve. And although it's bit weird in saying it, but I think a cybersecurity company, MSP, cybersecurity companies, everyone, once you've found that organisation that suits the way you're doing things, then you just want to hang on to them, because they're not all built the same, and sometimes, unfortunately, you just don't know what you're going to get, and that's kind of where at Siege we really try to understand the client and show them who we are and what we can do.
And certainly we have seen a client who has gone with an alternative provider, paid, in one case, triple what your quote was, and the report was rubbish.
I've seen that lots of times also, unfortunately.
So sometimes paying more doesn't mean that you're going to get a better output. And sometimes paying less doesn't mean that it's going to be on par either. I've seen some horrific reports, which is basically just a scripted scan of the environment. But that's also one of the reasons why we think that Siege Cyber provides incredibly good value for what a client would pay.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I mean, we see it all the time as well. But it's hard to tell a customer that, because no matter which way you say it, you're going to look like you're trying to sell them something,
So it sounds to me like you've got merit on either side of the debate.
I do.
There's value in having an alternative organisation do the assessment for you, and one of the ways that you mitigate that is by rotating your internal pen testers who have a varying degree of skill sets and strengths that they might gravitate to as part of the assessment, and also by keeping it boutique. You've got a principal consultant like yourself that can understand their environment to a more intimate level than what you might get if you go to the bigger end of town, where, like you said, there's possibly 3, 4, 5, 6 consultants on a single call that, as an organisation, you are ultimately paying for, or the insurance company is paying for, which means indirectly you're still paying for it. Yeah. So I certainly see some value in that. My comment would be that I have seen with some organisations that charge a lot more than Siege Cyber does, the quality of that report is not necessarily better, and in some cases it's a lot worse. I've seen the quality of the report being disappointing enough that I could have probably gotten a junior technician to run the same sorts of scripts and produce the same result. And philosophically, ethically, I just don't think that's the right thing to do. So I can certainly identify with what you're saying there. I've also seen the maturity of the work. So you and I have had a couple of clients that we've worked on together, and the different styles of assessment that have been done from one year to the next, the different style of pen test that the client has approved from one year to the next has been different. And there's been some different results as a byproduct of that. But if I understand correctly, you've also got some clients that you work with where you're not necessarily primarily engaged as a pen tester, you're actually operating there at a strategic level. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say about a year ago, we started moving more into compliance and advisory around like the fractional CISO or VCISO, mainly on an advisory point of view, working with boards. So as a representative in the board of directors, making sure the company has their security up to scratch, and just being available to answer any questions. A lot of organisations can't afford to have a full-time CISO, or they just need someone that they can reach out to and just ask questions. And that's kind of where at Siege we really have this relationship with our customers that isn't just we're going to come in and do your pen test and see you later and kind of cross our fingers hoping that we come back again next year. We really try to build that relationship that's ongoing. So we're always available if you need help, or if you want to work towards certain compliance like ISO or SOC 2, or you want some cybersecurity policies, or you just have general, hey, I don't know what's going on here. Someone's putting this in our network. What do you think? We're there as well for that. We kind of really want to be on the journey with our customers the whole way and have someone that they can always reach out to if necessary.
Yeah, brilliant. So there you are, folks. Coffee with a pen tester. Before we wrap up for today, I'd like to thank Pax8 for allowing us the access to their facilities and infrastructure for today's recording. For those of you who have stayed for the recording in its entirety, there will be a hyperlink with the number of the action items that Peter has spoken about. And finally, I would like to thank Peter and the team at Siege Cyber for coming in 2 days before Christmas.
Thank you. It's actually, I love the office, and it is an absolute pleasure to be here.
Thanks again.